Hello, everybody, and welcome to round 2 of Depth Recovery. And I am joined by my friends and colleagues, Joe Curran and Corey Gamberg. And Corey picked out the reading for this week, and it is, you know what the title of the book is called?
Yeah, it's called Imagination is Reality. Western Nirvana in Jung, Hillman, Barfield, and Cossier.
Really? Barfield, huh?
Yeah.
And we're looking as by a guy named Robert Avens, A-V-E-N-S. And we're looking at a book, chapter called Imagination in Jung and Hillman. And I read this twice, and the second time I read it, my head popped open. Okay. So I'm just gonna, you guys care if I just start by reading like the first 3 or 4 paragraphs?
Go ahead.
All right. In Jungian psychology, soul has an objective or collective aspect which shows itself in our capacity to conceive, imagine, behave, and be moved according to fundamental patterns called archetypes. The empirical knowledge of archetypes is derived mainly from philosophy, ethnology, the arts, religion, and mythology, because Jung believes that these fields contain the most adequate formulations of the objective or transpersonal psyche. I think I'll just stop there. So what happened when I read this the second time was immediately I started thinking, okay, addict as archetype, right? And one of the things that he makes clear in here about the archetype is that it has to be, it can't be imagined as a singular thing. So somewhere in here he talks about, say, a symbol of like a swan. Mm-hmm. And he says there can be Leda and the swan, or the swans at the Boston Common, or Zeus seducing the swan, or whatever that was. But what it means is that there's no fixed, singular
path.
Yeah.
Definition of the archetype.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting, though. I don't know what you're thinking, but I don't mean to interrupt either. But I guess that's interesting.
Well, go for it.
In the sense that, that's something that I think the idea of depth recovery is really trying to bring out, in the idea of what it would be like in sense of revisioning sponsorship. It's not something that is objective, that there's just one way to work with all drug addicts, and it's really honoring that each drug addict is going to have a subjective experience. And I think that a lot of the times, this is just my experience, or my thought at least, is that within sponsorship, what happens a lot is much more projection than allowing someone to have their own experience.
Yeah.
Right. Joe, do you have something real quick?
No, I was just gonna say that I had kind of had that same thought, only I wasn't thinking sponsorship. It was more just the archetype of the 12-stepper and like projecting that it has to be some singular way. Mm-hmm. And really, there could be a 12-stepper could mean a whole bunch of different things.
Okay, so what we've done now is we all want to go in 3 directions.
Yeah.
So all
right, go back to you
first.
Go back to you.
I just want to say something about the addict. So when you imagine all these ways we think of the addict, there's this sort of conventional way that most of us get subjected to in treatment. And he kind of really speaks to that, where he says on page 32 or 33, he says, he talks about there's being intellectu, the mind or the idea, and being in matter, the thing. Mm-hmm. So when we think about addicts in this sort of conventional academic sense, that would be, the thing would be the biology, the so-called disease idea of an addict. And then the mind thing would be, what we call the mental obsession. And the excluded middle is this third reality, which he calls being an enema.
Mm.
So this is that thing that we focus on so much, which is the feeling or the affective dimension of the addict. But what I also was thinking was, okay, so you have addict as disease, you have addict as genetic predisposition, you have all these sort of psychological, biological things. But then you start thinking about addict in terms of what addicts say about themselves, the way they talk about it. And they say dope fiend, crackhead, wino, drunk, chronic, speed freak. And so suddenly you have, when you start speaking in the addict's language, then you can see that the archetype really is, pretty fluid. And the experience of being an addict and then coming into recovery and getting some other definition that you either accept or you reject, and blah, 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 blah. But the other thing that really got me was the way Jung talks about how the archetype takes you, how the ego is not master of its own house. And so in active addiction, it does take you. When you are using, you are in the grip of this archetype, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're a dope fiend, you're in the grip of the archetype 24/7, because you wake up sick and you spend all your energy either sick or getting dope or high. If you're a functional alcoholic, you're kind of like the ego in the Jungian sense, or in the Hillman sense of the Hercules character, is in charge all day long without the drink. And then at some point later in the day, he succumbs and gives himself over to the archetype. I think you could argue that even that guy is in the grip of the archetype when he's sober, because he's moving back into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just bear with me.
Yep.
But then think about this. When we start looking at recovery in the 12 steps, there's all this emphasis on, you got to transcend the ego is the enemy and all that. But what I'm noticing is the ego is not master of the house when I'm using. The admission of powerlessness is just that. And what happens was when somebody gets sober, then the ego reasserts itself and tries to deny its own powerlessness, its own weakness, its own incapacity, its own inferiority. And so the real enemy isn't the ego in the sense of active addiction. It's the sense of it showing up in sobriety, trying to take over. It's not really, it's like you're not working with the powerlessness anymore. And so if you move all the way into the recovered addict, which I would say is still part of the archetype of the addict, that means there's been a continual working with the powerlessness. There's been an eclipsing of the ego by staying with the powerlessness. Does that make sense?
There's an eclipsing of the ego with the powerlessness. Is that what you said?
Yeah, if you're going to really recover from addiction, then you're going to first have to admit you're powerless, that you're in the grip of the archetype, the demon, possessed, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're sober, what your problem is not, it's the reassertion of the ego. That's the enemy. But the ego wasn't running the show when you were in active addiction. It just reasserts itself in early recovery.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have to actually stay with the powerlessness, stay with the humility and the deflation. And ideally the inventory and the amends keep you there, and then recovery can happen. Because we're not, it's not our egos running amok when we're out on the street doing drugs.
No.
Are.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you're saying. Yeah. I think that makes sense.
Would it be, do you think though that the ego, that happens unconsciously within the drug addict, or consciously the ego tries to assert itself?
I would say unconsciously, if I think about it.
But we're talking about the way our clients show up 4, 5, 7, 9 days sober,
Mhm.
you know, thinking they got it figured out, or they need to do these things, or they need to dominate the problems in their life in order to get better. I would say that is unconscious, yes.
Yeah.
But it's the ego in the human sense, in that Herculean sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Striving to have the power, striving to have the control. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that would speak that. I mean, that's kind of really what, like, I like something that Hillman said on the second page. I think it's page 32. Is he says something like he starts talking about the soul, but he says it in the sense of the soul cannot settle or conform because it is driven to reform, reformulate, and unsettle all forms. So it goes to this, which is like, you can see, and this might be totally out there, but you can see people who come into treatment who are really in an experience of soul, given that their whole life is just completely chaotic. There is no sense of control whatsoever. And
Right.
everything that they used to control their lives, whether it be the drugs or, you know, the external factors or the money or whatever, has fallen short. It's unsettled. It's depleted. So there's this notion that, again, like to this thing we've been talking about outside of work, the notion that they really experience the inferiority of their ego. But that is what you're speaking to, is to stay with that versus to run from it.
Right.
And understand, though, that it's this process of something like Hillman calls in another book, but he calls it the growing down experience. And growing down into the soul means like coming, you know, if you picture yourself, you know, born in the heavens, the idea is that the soul wants to experience humanness. And it's almost as if addiction is part of the soul's process to experience that. And if we can find our ability to sit in that suffering and that powerlessness, then that's when we actually have, quote unquote, a soulful experience or ensouled experience within the steps. To me, what's really interesting actually is that Hillman really says that we only have experiences or find meaning in moments when we're looking or living in a perspective of soul. So to think about it like that, to have the step experience, quote unquote, is really to be exactly where you were just talking, Piers, in the shit the whole time.
Yeah.
Because that's where the soul is. And most people, I feel like, run from that, and it becomes like, you know, I guess what you're saying, a very egoic attempt to control the experience versus let it happen.
Yeah.
That might be wrong, but I don't know.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm thinking, so, right, so just trying to, I don't have like a full coherent thought, I guess, but if emotions, so if you're thinking model of addiction, you think emotions are restless, irritable, discontent, right? They're in the soul. The emotions are in the soul, right? We need a psychic change in order to get better. So you sort of need a soul change in order to get better, right? Because psyche equals soul, right? So if I'm going to become recovered, right, then this is where I get lost. So if I have to become, if I'm going to become recovered, I have to deal with or work with the soul by, I don't know, staying in the shit.
Well, you're staying in the shit by acknowledging powerlessness.
Mhm.
You're staying in the shit by writing inventory. You're staying in the shit by reading inventory. You're staying in the shit by making amends. I'm saying, obviously, so here's the shit, and the ego is going to keep trying to like say,
Get
oh,
you out of it.
yeah, I want to transcend it. I want to deny it. I want to overcome these inferior qualities. But the humility that will keep things going is what leads to the transformation of recovered.
Can you say that again? You broke up.
The humility of staying in those things is what keeps the transformation happening.
Yeah.
And if we can stay in that humility enough, not that the ego isn't going to try to control occasionally, but we will stay in a state of constant transformation.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that the recovered addict is just a permutation or just another change in the archetype of the addict.
Sure.
Yeah. When Corey and I went on a brought this up before to Corey, but when Corey and I went and saw William Menninger,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think
Frozen.
Reality.
You're gonna have
They're
to
like,
say that again because you froze.
yeah, I was just saying that Menninger said when Corey and I went to the retreat with Menninger, he said that humility was really like grasping your reality. And that's what being humble was. So, I mean, you would think, so it's like, you know, and I guess if you're using sort of that definition of it, then you're saying that the addict is sort of detaching from their reality if they're not staying humble. They're not, you know.
Well, Holman would say the ego is always just popping up and trying to transcend the ugly, overcome the ugly, deny the ugly, hide the ugly, put the ugly past you forever.
Yeah.
And ideally, the transformation is. And so later in this article, you know, Hillman talks about there ultimately being a new perspective. They're talking about a new, very old way of being religious, where, you know, normally we have the ego and the world, and now we're going to eventually get a perspective that allows us to see the ego as part of that framework rather than seeing the world from that framework. It's like a new, it's a soul perspective is what he's naming.
You see, that's like something that's really interesting to me, just in the sense of how many times, you know, I think like one of the things that Hillman says, I don't know if it was in this book or not, but he says like he hates the words like healing, hates the word cure, you know, and it really like puts him on the outs in the psychotherapeutic community. But it's interesting because like the steps is like, you know, something that really offers like a transcendence. So it holds this idea that you will heal, you know, but there's also this notion that there are some things that are just not meant to be healed.
Right.
And like that is really, I think, what, you know, what you're talking about is like, and we have as drug addicts have to understand that that doesn't mean that someone's not recovered, or that doesn't mean that, and I think this is what people tell themselves, like, if I continue to feel this way, or this is still happening, or I have this struggle, then I must not have recovered because I can't transcend this problem.
Right.
And the perspective that Hillman is offering is to go into that problem. There's nothing to transcend. It's to stay there and work with that.
And I think in Christian terms, that would be something like, or Abrahamic terms, it would be staying with your creatureliness. That I am a creature, I am radically dependent. Therefore, inferiority is built into my relationship to God.
Yeah. I mean, what you were just describing to me, Corey, it's not really looking at the steps or the big book or recovery or any of that with the imagination. It's all just a literal sort of translation and version of recovery in the big book. And just, I don't feel good all of the time, then I must not be doing the right thing. And everybody else has to adopt that view as well.
Right. And there's this thing that I've been like saying this a lot, just coming out and working with clients and groups and stuff, but there's this notion of just this constant search for some utopia where all that is going to go away and all that is going to happen. And it just doesn't exist. Like, it's not, you know, Hillman really speaks to this notion for me that like when you're living life and it gets really messy, that you are experiencing soul. And
Yeah.
to run from that, to clean it up, is being stuck in the ego. That's the ego's doing. That's the ego's desire, because the ego does not want to accept its inferiority or its inability to fix this problem or to figure it out.
Hmm.
And I think to Piers's point, where when we started, that's how the ego then asserts itself back into the addict.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's just almost like a putting up like another persona to make sure that no one actually sees the truth of me.
Right.
The
Or
mess.
it's trying to say that the messiness was a temporary aberration.
Mm-hmm.
The new, the new and improved recovered Piers is the real Piers.
Right.
So I'm going to throw this question back at you then. So, all right. So you're saying that the early recovering addict, it has to stay humble, but the ego's trying to pull them out of it. So what about the addict who stayed sober for 5-10 years, whatever it is, and then relapse? Because now they should be void. What you're saying is they should be void of ego, because the addiction or the active addiction is not ego, but relapsing after 10 years is what? So the ego was there and then they lose that and then they go.
Right.
I would say that if we were going to talk about the dry drunk, just by way of example, in Hillman terms, we would be looking at somebody who can do Hercules better than I can.
Mhm.
And looking at somebody who's doing something Herculean.
Yeah.
And he does it until he can't do it anymore, and then the dam breaks and his inferiority is upon him once again. Whether he can work with that or not, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It really speaks to this notion, like that Piers, you were saying, that like in order to continuously transform, it's just a matter of, not necessarily, well, it is, I guess, a matter of just willingness to really stay in the thick of it, and not try to do this. Like, I was just thinking when you said Herculean, and like to think of someone who's white knuckling it, and then to think of the image of Hercules, like with his arms up like this, is pretty on point, because that's exactly what it is. Versus someone having enough, I guess, to Joe's point, humility to say that, like, yes, I'm not suffering from obsession and I feel that I've recovered, but my life is still a total mess, and I'm okay with that because
I'm a human being. I'm a
it's
creature.
my life and I'm working through it. And I think that's really, like, in so many ways, the kind of I don't know if recapitulation or revisioning of the steps is kind of all about to me, which is like, it's okay to continue on with those things. It's okay. It doesn't mean that you're less recovered. It doesn't mean you wrote a bad inventory. It doesn't mean any of those things.
Right. Well, that's what I was kind of talking about when I said, I was sort of, thinking of the archetype of the 12 stepper, is that there seems to be this idea around being a 12 stepper that once I reach some point in my step work that I should feel more or less content 90% of the time. I don't really have many struggles, and I write inventory every time I get resentful, and every time I do something wrong, I make amends for it. And I sponsor X amount of people, and I still go to my home group, and and like, if you don't do that, then you're not a 12 step.
Right.
So,
it's like you're a self-transcending being.
yeah, but that's just really taking everything to mean, like, they're taking the big book in the spirit of being literal or something like that. And it was interesting, is after we did the last talk just recently, when I was doing group, I did a question and answer group, and I had a question, and one of the questions was, do you believe in the 12 steps? And I kind of, it just caught me off guard, right? Because I was like, all we do here is we talk about the 12 steps, right? So to be asked, so I called the person out and I asked why, And she said, well, after your talk and what I heard you saying about the 12 steps and everything, like, do you believe it? And I was like, I actually understand where you're coming from. Like, if you watch the other talk, you'll know why. But, and I said, I actually understand and then I said, well, I guess it would really depend on what your definition of a 12 stepper is. And I said, if your definition of a 12 stepper is someone who writes inventory every time they get resentful and, they sponsor X amount of people and, they go to meetings and do a home group, I'd say, then no, I'm not. Right? If you're talking about a guy who's deeply interested in the spiritual and tries to help people, and that's your definition of a 12 stepper, then yeah, I guess I am. Right. So it's, it's really sort of like I guess maybe a semantical argument in some way or something like that, or what you mean by it. And you're taking a very literal sort of mindset at the 12 steps, and I'm not. Like, I'm just not. But you can think with the imagination a little bit, and maybe 12 step or sort of like, and I know that Corey and you and I have talked about this, and even Jung would say this, is like Jung didn't want there to be Jungians, and it's like, it sort of became like this really literal thing. And, and Jungians are actually kind of getting away from it in a way, which is like, you used to be able to go to the institute if you had a background in business or if you had a background in sports medicine or something like that. Now you have to have the degree in psychology, right? And maybe Austin's not quite there yet, but all the other ones, I think you have to have a degree in psychology in order to get into. And like, okay, if you're, again, like, Laura, what's it mean to be a 12 stepper? And should we have people who come from different backgrounds with different perspectives, and would that make it more fruitful?
Well, I mean, I think if the 12 stepper is actually an archetype, then that's exactly what it's supposed to do.
Right.
And, we get caught in these cookie cutter things where we're emulating sponsors and people went before us.
Yeah. Christianity goes through that problem.
Yes, and on 35, Jung talks about it. He says, in the world of organized religions, the tendency to suppress or at least to regulate individual symbol formation has led to paralysis of fantasy. In every closed system of religion, unconscious psychic processes, the numinosa, are channeled through ritual and sets of symbols which gradually become formalized to such an extent that the energy of the original experience is obliterated behind the protective walls of the symbolism.
Yeah.
So the big book becomes nailed down to 2 or 3 literal meanings. And if you step outside of that,
right,
you're not in this club.
Yeah. It's kind of, go ahead, Corey.
That's just what if you guys remember, I wrote that blog about the big book as a symbol.
Yeah, re-envisioning. Yeah.
Exactly what I was saying is that it's lost something for people because it's become so fixed in its place. There's no ability for people to look at it and have their own honest, subjective experience with it. Like, because what comes, especially if there are people who've relapsed multiple times working with the book, it's hard to even come to it for a 5th, 6th, 7th time, especially in treatment, and look at it and expect to hear anything different because you've become so fixed in what it means.
Well, and it loses, ironically, in all of this conversation, when that happens, it loses soul.
It does. And I think it becomes an ego fantasy.
So that's interesting. If it loses the soul in that way, and exactly what you need to get better is a soul experience, then it's probably going to be you're going to have a hell of a hard time getting sober.
Well, I mean, I think what happens is, when I said just a second ago, I called it an ego fantasy. So when we get into this world of circuit speakers who are overwhelmingly middle-aged white guys, they're all kind of riffing off each other, and it's kind of a variation on a theme, and it presents a kind of recovery that even my sponsor used to say, my life looks a lot better than it actually is. And
Sure.
So it presents a kind of fantasy of what the ego just loves, I could, and that there's no messiness at the podium.
The persona of the circuit speaker.
There you go.
Yeah.
Definitely not the archetype of the circuit speaker.
No, and what's interesting, man, is I think that if we were going to pinpoint an archetype, like for the 12-stepper, I kept thinking of the wanderer. You know, it's the archetype of the wanderer. Like he never really fixates in one place. He goes from path to path, from idea to idea, from practice to practice, and that is really, I think, in my opinion, that would be the archetype of someone, or the addict in recovery. Not necessarily an active addiction. That would probably be some sort of, you know,
Well, I like 12-stepper actually. Although I think you can have, you know, if it were going to be true to the idea of archetype, you have the wanderer, but also you have the fire breathing
big book
evangelist and the fundamentalist. But because it's always this transformation. But the wanderer is, yeah.
And the wanderer is the one who gets lost.
Yeah.
And the wanderer is the one, you know, you need to have that experience. It's almost like, to me, it's like that's when people can really have the experience of the steps, when they're lost. And when the steps, this thing that they held to some high thing of, okay, this is going to change my life. They're actually confronted with the reality that, or yes, I'm not drinking and I'm not getting high. I'm fairly happy, but there are a lot of things that are still wrong in my life. That's when there's this ability to really have some sort of experience.
Right. There's literally questions that can't be answered by the toolbox that I have.
Yeah.
Therefore, I can move.
And that's like a sense of freedom that I think a lot of people, frankly, I think a lot of the stuff that you see on, you know, Facebook and whatnot about people, you know, leaving AA, I think that's what they get caught up on, and this idea that, you know, they don't feel like they can talk to other people in that community about that experience. We talked about that in the first discussion, really. There's this notion that if you want to go outside of that toolbox, that just means you didn't understand the tools enough.
Yeah.
Which isn't true. There's just this reality, just to Jung's point on that page 35, which is these things start to get fixed in place and they lose something. And that's natural.
I mean, and even to think of it like, I don't even think that Bill meant it that way. I mean, we know enough about history at this point to know that a lot of what he wrote isn't even real. It was just Bill trying to make a point, right? So, you know, it's like we're going to start taking some made up story literal, right? So, you know, and that, you know, and even to Pierce's point, and I don't have the big book near me, but you know, there's Bill kind of even hints at like this, not that he would think of it like this or was thinking of it like this, but I think it's at the end of the doctor's opinion where he starts talking about the different type of drinkers, right? Yeah. That's like the archetype of the addict. I think he says there's something like a guy who's totally normal in every respect except when it comes to drinking, and then there's the manic depressive type, and then there's, you know, so he says that there's these you know, he's not using this language, but you know, there is this archetype of the addict there, and then he's telling a whole bunch of stories to make a point that we know aren't factual to an extent, right? And you know, so to start saying that it has to be done this way, and this is what this means, and this is, you know, that's just, I don't even understand how that could be right.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
It's true. I love what you said, though. You said, you know, you basically said that that Bill writing the big book was in kind of what Hillman calls a poesis.
Yeah.
He's not literally reporting something. He's doing something kind of literary, and that's true to soul in that sense. But then we literalize it.
Yeah, and not for nothing, Bill had problems. He struggled with depression for the rest of his life.
Tons of problems.
Yeah.
And a couple other things too.
Yeah. I wasn't gonna go there.
I think that's interesting too, because I think Jung and, you know, anyone in the depths, I call it, well, probably more Jungians versus any other sect, but, and Hillman for sure would say this, that like the psyche speaks or the soul speaks in exaggeration. And that's what Bill did, was he exaggerated everything in the book to make a point across.
Right.
Say that, you know, if you know you have a dream where, you know, the psyche's trying to tell you that you need to make a move, right? A simple step in another direction, the psyche might have you riding a tractor trailer and bring it right through a whole building to
Right.
get attention. So it exaggerates what it wants you to understand. So Bill, into Piers's point, Bill actually did a very soulful thing.
Yeah.
And then it's this consistent reading of it that, you know, this is this thing that I was talking about earlier, is like, you have your experience, and now that's the experience you read the book from, and then that's the experience you want to put on someone else. We really don't let people have their own experience. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
A lot of the time I'm projecting what this is like for me and what this step looked like, and then it's like you take it on in so many ways. And then, you know, when someone, I actually was fired as someone's sponsee one. This was, I mean, more than once, but this was one of the first times when I was like a few years sober maybe, and the kid had relapsed. And I was really in this, you know, mindset of, well, dude, you weren't writing inventory and you weren't doing this. And he actually looked at me and he said, you ever think I'm not supposed to do all those things like you? And I went, no, I haven't. So, because that's all I know. And, you know, that was actually right before, ironically enough, right before I went to work at the Plymouth House, which would have been interesting to actually hold on to that conversation and bring with me. You
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Well, your time there would have been shorter.
It was definitely like foreshadowing in so many ways, that conversation.
It was an omen.
Yeah. But, you know, I just think like I have done that quite a bit. And even in treatment, reading the big book with so many people, it just becomes, this is what this means. This is what you need to take from it. And the reality is that might not make any sense to someone. It might mean something totally different. And we shouldn't be like, you know, in a community or in a recovery collective where we think there's one way to do or one way to interpret one thing.
And look
Yeah.
how refreshed we are, how it's like spring breeze when one of our clients comes at us with something truly original and truly authentic, and we haven't even thought of it before, and we're like, oh wow, you
Yeah.
know.
And that's somebody who really has an experience with the big book and the steps.
Yeah.
Because it's their own thing, their own interpretation, their own image that comes out of themselves of what this thing is saying to them.
Right.
Then imagine being told, no, that's not what that actually means. It means this.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that person's probably going to be pretty disenchanted with pursuing recovery.
Yeah.
You know?
So it feels like we've moved. So, you know, last time we spoke, when we're kind of just speaking this depth recovery thing, we were talking about this getting to places where you need something more, and that these are certain kind of resources that allow that get you out of the literal, a movement towards soul. And then this time we're getting closer to really looking at what the ego is, that it's not really the cause of the addiction. It's not where the addict is really living most of his time in active addiction. It is simply something that shows up in recovery as an adversarial or as a stumbling block. It shows up early, right away, you know, I got to take care of all these things and then I can conquer addiction. But then it also shows up later when the ego starts taking credit for the recovery itself. So these two Herculean kind of gestures. And so we kind of are moving towards this really interesting place of there's something that the soul has to stay with in order to remain in recovery. That makes sense? And I think the encounter with the ego by the soul is just part of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know who said this, and I think Joe, you would know more. It might have been Menninger, it might have been Keating. It was just one of those guys, or it might have even been Bill Whigamore, but he would always talk to us about like this notion that like you need to have an ego, and
Yeah.
like it's not
Yeah.
about this idea of being egoless or not having it, but it's about being able to have one in a healthy relation to something else. And I think that's
Yeah.
what you just spoke to, which is
Yeah.
sticking with soul and following this thread where like wherever it's pulling, but also like having some sort of agency of knowing that that's what you're doing, and you're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, Hillman calls that relativizing the ego.
Yeah.
That that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to destroy, that would be, if you destroyed your ego, that would be pretty
Well,
bad.
You'd be in a wheelchair probably.
Yeah. But it's more just like, I think it might have been Keating, but I think it was more just making sure that the ego's healthy, I guess is the best way to put it.
But it's interesting what you said, Piers, which is that the ego is the adversary to the soul. Or did I just think about that?
That might be you.
Yeah. Oh,
But
sorry.
the ego takes us towards away from inferiority, towards the Herculean metaphor, and it's trying to, I mean, I think it is at its worst, it's egotism. It is setting itself up as something like God. Self-made man, captain of my own destiny, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. So, any last words, people?
What about the people, I'm just thinking as we're talking about thoughts are coming up. So what about people who are just super egotistical and manage to stay at the Herculean? Not a dry drunk, but although maybe they are kind of a dry drunk in some ways, but someone who's all about ego in recovery and flash and materialism and manage to stay sober.
Well, Hillman says the narcissist is trying to, Hillman would say anything truly initiatory is always going to be at the expense of the ego. So the ego will get small, there'll be a loss of social identity, dissolution, this thing Corey was talking about, this descent.
Yeah.
But the narcissist, somebody he is trying to kill the soul life at the expense of the ego. And what Hillman says about that is, but you can't kill the soul.
No.
And so
you end up in conflict.
Yeah. So what happens is, he says like a serial killer or something, he's actually trying to destroy the images of the feminine. And he can do that you can literalize that and kill someone, but then the images come back and he feels compelled to kill it again.
Yeah, it's kind of like the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain kills the image he has for himself by killing Abel.
Yeah.
But that is just really the main problem of people that I think is that we see now in treatment is that there's really a struggle. The struggle seems to have gotten harder to really allow or to accept the kind of dissolution of the ego over time. And maybe you guys like can see this or not, but we talk a lot about like just talking about people's willingness to make sacrifices, and like that is at, like you said, Piers, at the expense of the ego, because it is truly initiatory. And what you see now with the drug addict is that they're hip to the game, like they're equipped with this knowledge about their treatment processes and the world of treatment before they come in, that they're already coming in. I don't even think they're how you described here, 6, 7, 8, 9 days sober, really kind of defeated. They're more so 6, 7, 8, 9 days sober, already the ego is back.
Hmm.
You know, already. So what I'm saying is I think the gap between that time has actually gotten smaller over the course of the last 10 years because the addict comes in with more of a loaded arsenal than they ever did before in so many ways.
No.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, that could be a whole show. Why is that? I mean, is it in part because they don't have a capacity for reflection like they did? They don't, they can't slow down. Is it also that they have lived lives where they've been in the archetype of addiction or some sort of cultural pathology for so long that the second the ego has a chance to take control or to assert itself, it's like a vacuum. It has to go in there and do that. It's like an unconscious like assumption that, well, I was just in all the madness and chaos. I was in the underworld on Mass Avenue. The only other thing could be is my ego asserting itself against all that. You know, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is becoming a bigger and bigger fight to have right away with people.
Oh yeah, we have people that can't hear us because they're just thinking about all the things they're going to do to get better.
It's just crazy, but not even beyond that. It's just they all think that, you know, getting better is going to mean, is going to mean not losing or giving anything up.
It means bliss.
It means what?
Yes.
Bliss.
Yeah.
That, you know, recovery is going to be this thing where everything that I still have in my life is actually just going to get better as a result of this. When in reality, if you're in or pursuing recovery, you might lose all of those things. And then the idea is that you still pursue recovery.
Yeah.
Most people are so against that from the jump. You know, I mean, personally, I don't feel like I've seen someone who's come in and been like, I am fucking defeated and I'll do whatever, in quite some time. You know, when it used to just be like the norm, like people would come in and they'd be fucking depleted and they'd go, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's another side of this. I think that, like, you know, it comes from the archetype of either the treatment center or the archetype of the treatment worker. And I think it gets worse when, and we all are, but, you know, or it can become more difficult when the treatment worker is also an addict or a recovered addict. But, you know, there's this, you know, you could come at it from so many different angles, I guess, but I think that the treatment worker also has their utopia of how the treatment center will be.
Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, they always have this image in their head of how, especially addicts who first get in it, like how it's going to be and how it's going to better their recovery and right. And, you know, and I mean, it's hard, like even as, you know, the treatment guy who works in a treatment center, like I think of, you know, the fantasy treatment center in my head. That's going to be the perfect one with the perfect clients. And, you know,
I thought you were talking about me.
Yeah. That doesn't necessarily happen, you know, all the time. But, you know, to Corey's point, and I think this is the archetype of the treatment center. I think this is, you know, being hip to the game and stuff like this. Like, you know, the amenities of the treatment center, you know, start to outweigh the recovery of the treatment center or the treatment of the treatment center.
Well, sure. Yeah. It becomes more about
like a coddling. I don't have to sacrifice anything.
Yeah.
Right.
It becomes more about where can I go where I can be enabled more.
And if you were anything like me, by going to the treatment center, you're actually gaining a lot. Because it's different than sleeping outside. Right now I get the warm bed with the flat screen in my room, and you know, I get catering every single day, and you know, I just got coddled. I didn't sacrifice anything. I gained a whole bunch.
You know, it's really funny when what's really working for us as colleagues, it's often when it's really the messiest, when the treatment center is actually all in the mess, and there's these little gold nuggets in the poop, and there's humor. There's a lot of humor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. And I mean, again, you know, I love that shit that Hillman says, man, about being lost. That's totally okay. You know, it's totally okay. And I think like a lot of people in not even early recovery, but more so long-term recovery don't think that that's okay. You know, like it's all right if things fall apart, man. You know, it's okay.
It's all right to say to your sponsee or client, I don't know.
Yeah, you know, I really kind of take to helping people in a way now where I don't really offer any answers. I just ask them more questions.
Yeah.
Because then they can figure it out. And, you know, there are these people, and we've seen this with some of our clients, you know, like we're definitely not doing this thing where I think we've all done before, which is really, you know, held sober living and aftercare over people's heads. And most people, through their own doing, are coming 3-4 weeks into their treatment and going, I think I'd go to that sober living house.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting just to see, you know, when you allow someone to have their own experience, really, they end up doing those things that you would want for them to do anyway. I mean, there are different levels of that. You definitely got to prod and push some people a little bit more, but there are those, like Piers said, those, you know, golden nuggets that they come in one day and they say it, and you're like, fucking right.
Yeah.
It's happening. Like you're doing it. Just keep going. And it's really refreshing actually to see that.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Well, gentlemen, we banged out an hour.
Already?
That's good. Corey's got to get to his chicken farm.
That's right. Can't leave anything in the microwave over there.
I got 5 minutes left. I got plenty of time. But I think that this stuff and this idea of really trying to figure out the battle between the soul and the ego is something at the heart of what depth recovery will really end up being.
Right. And I think what we just did is we actually reposition those things in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I wasn't like in the grip of my ego when I was shooting dope 24/7.
No, that's not the ego, right? The ego doesn't want to even admit that it has a drug problem.
Right. But my 8 months of sobriety before steps, my ego was constantly trying to fix myself and hide myself and better myself and step out of the muck. And then my step experience said, no, let's go back and look at this.
Yeah. And that's maybe to your point about what I was saying about, you know, the drug addict is that, you know, they've lost this ability, or maybe not even an ability, but they've just, you know, younger people especially, like if you hand them a book and you say, okay, read this and let me know what it was about, they like YouTube it or Google it, and then they'll say, this is what the book means. They can't even think in a way where they can use the faculties of the soul or the imagination. And so they can't even go inward and be reflective, you know. And that's what you're speaking to, is that like in order to really pursue and stay in recovery is this constant reflexiveness over and over and over. No matter how far away you are from a drink or whatever, you still have to remain reflexive. And when that stops, I think that's when the ego comes back in. You know, so the soul is reflexive in so many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good stuff, people.
Thanks, Piers.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Corey.
You're welcome.
All right, people. To our audience, round 3 will come at you in a couple months. And just so you know, we will be reading something for every session, and we will let you know what it is. So with that, you boys have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.